Hi there, this is David Roach, Independent Strategy and Quantum Economics. Wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you're at, hello. Today we're going to be talking about climate change. And for once, which is a big change, we have somebody sharing the call with me who actually knows what he's talking about. That's Nick Kennedy from Independent Strategy, who is our leading research analyst on all questions relating to the climate. And what we're going to start off with is to discuss the IPCC. Now, what is the IPCC? Well, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all of that. And it is really the equivalent to climate change of what the Vatican is to Catholicism. It's the place where, the whole thing is meant to be centered. And this week, the IPCC published the first of 3 reports looking at climate change. The chapter which they have published is quite a long read, 4,000 pages or thereabouts, which deals with probably what we all knew, which is that man is responsible for climate change. So climate change is man-made. And the next chapters are going to be, well, what damage is it really doing? And the last chapter is, what do we do about it? Now, I don't think we actually need to wait for the 3 succeeding years to get the 4,000 pages a year to read about. So what we're actually going to do is cut to the quick and talk to Nick about it. Nick, the IPCC, what do you think of it? What do you think of its report?
I mean, it's a critical group in terms of analysing the risks to the climate. I mean, they are the backbone of all the science. The 4,000-page report, or near enough 4,000-page report they compiled was basically a distillation of all of the leading climate papers we've seen over the last few years. I mean, I think they got through 17,000 papers. So it's the most comprehensive collection and analysis of all of the climate data we've got to date. So the science behind it is very, very rigorous and very thorough, which all sounds pretty encouraging. I mean, these are the smartest climate minds on the planet, all tackling this problem. The problem, I suppose, with it is it's just the science. They outline various scenarios within that, and those scenarios range from sort of a mild scenario, which is meeting the Paris targets, to the sort of more apocalyptic scenario where by the end of the century, the average temperature of the planet's sort of 4 or 5 degrees centigrade warmer. Thereafter, we're cooked. But they don't ascribe probabilities to the scenarios. So they merely outline, if this happens, if X happens, Y is the consequence, which you could argue isn't particularly helpful. I mean, their argument is we are the panel, intergovernmental panel, i.e. they are the consensus views of scientists that are presented to governments, and then they present the conclusions to governments, and it's up to the governments to act. So they analyze the data, they tell us what the problem is, but then they pass the buck onto the politicians to deal with it.
So how likely are the politicians to deal with it? Surely very unlikely indeed.
Yeah, I'm incredibly unlikely. I mean, barely a day had passed from the IPCC being championed by the White House, then the Biden administration was talking to OPEC about raising production to lower energy prices to support the economic recovery. That these fundamental contradictions between what politicians need in the short term and what the planet needs in the long term, you cannot resolve that, I don't think. That's the fundamental problem. And if one country resolves it in isolation, that probably isn't enough to move the needle, so that disincentivizes them from acting unilaterally. But it's difficult to forge a consensus when you've got short-term pressures on politicians like the next election or the next party meeting in certain other countries.
Yes, I mean, it's worth noting that the United States government, the Biden administration, has, by executive decree, said that it is now party to the Paris Treaty on Climate, but in reality, it has not been approved by Congress and is very, very unlikely to get brought for Congress because the oil lobby is so strong and Americans love their big gas guzzling cars. Isn't that a fair assessment?
Yeah, entirely. I mean, it's easy to come up with the rhetoric to say we are committed to meeting these targets, but unless you actually are willing, you have the sort of political mandate to do so. And in the States, they don't. I mean, you can't. The reason why the Paris Accord wasn't approved by the previous administration was because it could never have got through Congress because of the traditional carbon lobby and the various other groups are supporting that. And yeah, if you drive around in a 5-litre V8 everywhere, in a 4-ton SUV, you're not going to help the planet.
Well, listen, Nick, let's cut to the quick here. What is your path for global warming? Where do you think it is going to go between now and when it matters?
I mean, probably by 2050, I would suspect we're closer to 1.8 to 2 degrees of warming, maybe not 2 degrees, but certainly 1.8 of warming. I mean, the planet's already warmed between 1 and 1.2 degrees already. Carbon emissions are continuing to increase. So the idea of getting to net zero by 2050, even if you can reach that point, we're probably looking at CO2 levels in the atmosphere being sort of 2/3 higher than they were in the pre-industrial period. And that's a lot. You've got to go back 3 million years to get to similar levels of carbon concentration into the atmosphere. And 3 million years ago, the temperature was about 4 centigrade warmer. I mean, obviously things change as well, and there's other factors within that and what we can do to mitigate those things. That's the bottom line. You need a significant change in habit to reach the Paris levels, and that's not going to happen. And then by the end of the century, you're looking at sort of 2.5 centigrade warmer, which doesn't sound too much, but I think one of the things that are perhaps not portrayed in the data, the simple number of, oh, we're going to be 1 degree warmer doesn't sound very much. But if your starting point's 14 degrees and you're going to 15 degrees, it doesn't sound too much either. But if you're going from 14 degrees to 18 degrees, in percentage terms, that's a huge increase. The impact of the temperature it's not just the mean temperature that changes, it's the variance in temperature or climate that changes as well. So you get much more extreme weather events. For every degree of warming, the atmosphere can hold 7% more moisture. The warmer the atmosphere is, the more energy is contained with it as well. You'll get more drought, you'll get more extreme heat. So if the temperature rises 1 degree, you might have a heat wave that's 10 degrees higher. Certainly in the Arctic and places like that, which we're seeing fires in places that traditionally don't burn as much.
Right.
So
now, Nick, you have written several pieces which actually does give some ray of hope, but they're not really based on politicians or on the whole process of forging a consensus by the IPCC. It's actually based on what I would call disruption, and disruption by market forces, which make some of the worst culprits in terms of CO2 and methane emissions redundant and obsolete, rather like dinosaurs, and brings in new solutions, which are renewable energy, which are actually driven by market forces. Could you give us your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, like most things, politicians are good at sort of putting things back together again, maybe, but they're not drivers of change. And historically, technology is always the main disruptor. Governments aren't disruptors. It's the technology that drives things. So I think if you look at how renewable energy costs have just collapsed far quicker than even sort of some of the more optimistic estimates, like the IEA, for example, is probably 30-40 years wrong in terms of what the cost of solar will be. It's getting to a point where the cost is so low you can afford to replace existing carbon energy sources in multiple times for the same cost. And obviously it's a much more efficient process. Sticking a solar panel up negates the need to drill for gas, transport it, refine it, ship it, burn it, and all those processes that are involved in that. You just build a solar panel and it churns out electricity. So it might not be as efficient on a cloudy day, but if you can afford to build 10 times the capacity, you're covered for those scenarios. So a combination of wind and solar, even without battery storage, is getting to a point where it's a completely viable substitute. And that's providing baseload power, which everyone frets about. Oh, what happens if it's a cloudy day and there's no wind, and how are we going to run everything? I mean, you get around that by just building a lot more capacity. So if a solar panel goes from being 100% efficient to 10% efficient when it's cloudy, you're covered. And if the wind goes from 5 miles an hour to 1 mile an hour, you're covered. And if you really need a security blanket, you can build a little bit of battery storage as well. But the cost of those are going to be so low. and it's going to drive disruption, and that in turn generates new opportunities.
What about feedback loops? I mean, there are obviously, and it's not easy to imagine them in the case of a positive scenario. In a negative scenario, you can see that the feedback loops are extremely dark. That the climate, the temperature increases by X, moisture increases in the atmosphere, violent meteorological events and flooding and the disappearance of whole island states ensues. That's easy to see that and make a horror movie out of it. But what about the opposite? That given market-based solutions, you get some positive feedback loops that possibly might save us all. For example, if you install all the renewable energy capacity you need to deal with peak loads, that might be affordable, but it also will generate surpluses which can be used, for example, to replace all forms of fossil fuels in heating homes or transport or so on. What's the positive feedback loop story in what you have described as being disruptive market forces?
I think there's a huge amount of potential for positive feedback loops to transform all sorts of aspects of the economy and society. I mean, so many things are energy cost prohibitive. So, for example, carbon capture technology is pretty energy intensive. If you've got 10 times your baseload capacity in solar and on a sunny day, you're going to be able to use all that energy, repurpose that energy for things like that, or food production, precision fermentation, and those kind of technologies. You can use energy to accelerate those kind of processes as well. So that could transform agriculture, which is a huge emitter of CO2. 70% of agricultural land is basically used for rearing animals. If you can use that energy to build cell-based meats in the laboratory and mass produce those and commercialize those, you free up all of that land for rewilding and other social uses that are virtuous and self-reinforcing. So you get
that's a very balanced picture. Now, obviously, we have to come down to the question of what's the investor message from all this? Do we rush out and buy all of these stocks which have already gone up a lot? Do we bide our time and wait for a shakeout? Do we actually short the debt securities of governments who won't be able to do anything material about this and therefore will eventually become insolvent? How do you play that?
Well, for starters, it's the companies that drag their feet and aren't willing to engage in the reality of what this technology is going to deliver are going to just be left for dead. You've got certain companies that embrace the change. Some of the automakers are really investing heavily in electric vehicles, for example. So that splits the field in that way. The energy companies, I mean, branding yourself as a green energy company is kind of a bit of an oxymoron, really. But I mean, they have scope to drive investment rather into new gas fields and new oil fields, into building out infrastructure that you need, energy infrastructure you need, and other complementary things. So the ones that do that are going to survive. The ones that don't won't. And then you've just got the underlying problems that arise from a warmer planet. If you're looking at a planet that's sort of 2.5 degrees warmer by the end of the century, that's going to create significant disruption. So areas that are exposed to that, you don't want to be invested in. Real estate.
That's very interesting. So actually, you have, when I go into what your analysis is, you can certainly see the dark side of the incapacity of public policy to actually deal with this by substituting a longer time frame for a shorter voter-inspired time frame. But when you go into the mechanics of what could happen, which would make things better, the market disruption is, and the feedback loops, which are positive, which come out of that, I think are important for people to consider. And what you're telling people to do investment-wise is less than, buy the biggest producer of solar panels you can find, but actually to play or to invest in long positions in quite established sectors, automobiles, energy, which are embracing the change, you're going to be a part of it, and to actually be short those which are going to be wiped out like dinosaurs off the planet. I think that's it, really, as a summary of what you said. Can I say thanks everybody for watching this, and subscribe and give us a like if you like us. And it's really goodbye, good night, and turn off the lights. Well, not quite.